I want to talk about this honestly. This is really interesting, and hopefully I can demonstrate the problems with the idea of King James onlyism, because I actually identify quite closely to people who are KJV only. I kind of wanted it to be true. People have pointed out that Seventh-day Adventists, which is what I am, uh, are kind of partly to blame for KJV onlyism, and it seems to be kind of true to some degree. And even some people today cling to that idea more in a way that I don't think they should. We're not saying the KJV is bad. It's just not the right way to go. And I think this is best demonstrated. I'll just kind of speak to it without trying to demonstrate anything. I just want to kind of point something out to just think about it if you're KJV only, regarding how to interpret Daniel 8, which is regarded as one of the most difficult chapters in the Bible to properly understand because of the way it relates to the prophecies in Daniel. Whatever your position is, whether you're Adventist or not, looking at kind of from a sitting back and saying what people say that's semi-reasonable. I'm not looking to push my view, although the Seventh-day Adventist view is absolutely the correct view and makes the most sense. But from what people point out, this is one of those difficult chapters. And here's some of the reasons for that is, so if you're KJV only, the KJV adds the word sacrifice over and over because it talks about the tamid or whatever, the olat sacrifice, the continual sacrifice. In regular narrative of the Bible, the daily sacrifices, the morning and evening sacrifices that they performed at the temple or whatever, it was the morning and evening or the continual daily sacrifices being offered. And it was always called the morning and evening sacrifices, or some shortened version of that in just historic narrative, let's say. When you get to Daniel 8, and it's using temple symbology in this sort of mix of Daniel's, historic record and then his visions, which are apocalyptic, symbology used, and how the 2300, which isn't, by the way, it isn't the 2300 morning and evening sacrifices, but people relate it to that. But it actually uses the term that's describes a day from Genesis, 2300 evening mornings, because the evening comes first. But whenever the sacrifices are talked about, they're morning, evening. Now, in Daniel 8, it's the daily sacrifice is how it's translated in the English in the King James Version. Now, the Hebrew in Daniel 8, and if you'll see this in the KJV, the word sacrifice is in italics. Is what that means is it's added by the translator. Now, is that inspired, the word sacrifice in Daniel 8, when it translates it, the daily sacrifices? Is that inspired? Is that correcting the Hebrew, which doesn't have the word sacrifices in there? It doesn't say a lot tamid. It says the tamid. It takes the adjective of daily sacrifices, that idea, and it turns the adjective and uses it as a noun with a definite article. It's so literally a word-for-word translation from Daniel 8 would be, he takes away the tamid, the daily, or the continual. It's an adjective used as a noun with a definite article. It doesn't say the daily sacrifices in the original text. It doesn't say that. So what's right? Is the daily sacrifices the right translation? Because a word-for-word translation, an accurate word-for-word translation would be something like, and the daily, or the continual. Would be a word-for-word exactly what it was in the original text. Now, what's right? Is the King James Version right when it calls it the daily sacrifices? No, it absolutely is not right. That's an interpretation embedded into the English translation. So it's wrong. It's literally wrong, unless you think the King James writer or translators literally fixed the Hebrew text by giving their interpretation in the translation of English into English. It's not 2300 days. Doesn't say, it's not the word for days in the Hebrew. A word for word translation would be 2300 evening mornings. It's the words word for word evening mornings, but the King James says days. That's an interpretation into the English in the translation. Is that correcting the Hebrew when they didn't take the word in Hebrew that's translated in other places in the King James Bible, it didn't say yom there. It doesn't say yom. Yom is the word for days. They put days in the English text. It says evening and mornings, which would be a word for word translation. Now tell me, King James only, is that important information to know about the Hebrew text? The answer is obviously yes, because we're dealing with apocalyptic literature and acknowledge the most difficult chapter in the Bible to understand. And if you don't know those details and you're going to be belligerent about it, then you're just being dishonest. Was the text wrong the whole time in the Hebrew and other languages before the English language even existed? So I would argue this: their thought translation there is wrong. If you're an Adventist, you definitely think adding sacrifices confuses the matter. And people say Adventists need it to say 2,300 days. Absolutely no, we do not. I want to make it clear. It says evening and mornings. It's very important because it's symbolic for days. So there's a sense where days is the right translation, depending on your interpretive understanding. I'd be inclined to want to point out what the text actually said originally. And it's not days. Days is an interpretation, which you should then interpret yourself as being symbolic for years. So is years, if that's correct, just like should it then be years? 2,300 years would be no. You don't do that with the text. You translate what it says, and then you use an interpretive method from there. But you want to know exactly what the original text said. So the word sacrifice in Daniel 8 doesn't belong. You know why? Because it doesn't exist in the original text. That's an interpretation put into the translation. At least they put italics, the word sacrifice. But you don't really understand the construction in the original language, which can confuse it. It makes it seem like it's more of a literal thing talking about Antiochus Epiphanes, because in the translation, they kind of literalize the language out of the symbolicness of it, you could say. I'm a layman, so I'm just kind of speaking in my own sort of way of understanding it, not technically. But that's how I understand that. Pretty sure that's accurate. So if you're King James only, you have to come to this conclusion, like, what are you willing to say about the nature of the translation? And it gets to a point where it gets dishonest, where it matters what the original text says and what they chose to translate it, and to be aware of that. But if you're going to be like, oh, the King James Bible is flawless, therefore the word sacrifices, even though it's not in the original text, it's a interpretive addition. That's the question. Are the italicized words, which they're being honest about adding, are those inspired words? Or are they just a helpful guide? Well, are they inspired or not? Is there, it's just like the book of Hebrews says Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. That's a big problem for dispensationalism. If Paul wrote it, I think he did. It's his theology anyway. But was that inspired when the King James writers said, oh, the book of Hebrews is an epistle of Paul? Or did they get that wrong? And if they got that wrong, what does that mean? Well, from a normal standpoint, from a reasonable standpoint, we say, well, the translators aren't inspired like the original authors are. Look, it doesn't even really matter, because 20 different people who read the King James Bible, even if it was word for word inspired, flawless, like a Muslim would say about the Quran or something, even if that were true, 20 different people interpret those words differently. So, but it's about preservation, right? So, and like I said, again, I would say the King James Bible is inspired. It's just not the translation of it. It's the original text underlying it. We don't need a perfect word for word translation. It doesn't even make sense. It doesn't even, it's an unsustainable idea that just misses the reality about what happens when you go from one language to another. And we don't have to defend that idea. It's not feasible. It's a mistake to try to defend such an idea, because it's not even wrong, in other words. Now, Everything I'm saying, what does that mean? Does it mean I think the King James Bible is a bad Bible? No. It's my preferred Bible. In many cases, I think it preserves the right way to understand the text. And it just kind of overrides a lot of funny business, or I think putting too much weight on other manuscripts in certain ways. I'm even open to there being manuscripts that they bring into these other texts that are actually not good manuscripts. But sorry, the King James Bible is not perfect, whatever that's supposed to mean. It's not sustainable, and it's indefensible when you get down to the realities of translations. The word sacrifice doesn't belong in Daniel 8 because it actually misleads people to what the original text says in the way it's constructed in the language, in the symbolic kind of usage of ideas. So anyways, something I learned on my journey. I hope it helps you.